Creation's Journey to Life, Day 16. Atheism failed as home for reason. Read all of this writing to gain context and answer the question for yourself if Jesus were not, in fact, been the first atheist. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to consider atheism as an alternative to the obvious fanatical irrationality of the ways of faith religions that is patterning the world towards war, conflict, poverty, and suffering, when it shows that atheism is equally bastardized by haters and fanaticism. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to see atheism be represented publicly by those that use atheism as a label to attack society, religion, and family in spiteful and vengeful ways without presenting a common sense, reasonable solution to create a stable, peaceful, and harmonious society. This can be seen in the comments of the Day 15 blog, which can be seen here, where the minority presents themselves as the voice of atheism in less than reasonable ways, while the common sense majority of atheists remain silent yet supportive of common sense, as shown here in the original blog, Day 15, Who Am I, Prisoner of the Mind? This degrading of atheism through just another religion, ruled through abuse and destructive irrationality in an attempt to generate fear, being allowed by the majority of atheists to represent them as a group, will certainly not lead to atheism playing any major role in establishing a world of reason where life as the common denominator in all beings will be honored. Obviously, this is not what the serious atheists intended, but a cleaning of the ranks to a common principle of reason is suggested. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that atheism is formed from the words at, the, is, implying the present awareness of common sense, mathematical, scientific, deductive reasoning as the true measurement of what is here as a physical reality. This should be enough as a living principle used by reasonable men and women to challenge the rationality of faiths that cause the world and society so much harm. Yet, atheism has fallen in the same trap as religions and made no difference to the accepted ways of society, and in fact, embraced much of the trepidation that is created through profit, greed, and consumerism in a way that implies a form of giving up in the face of the fanaticism that threatened to abuse anyone that dare to stand in its way to expose the abuse that is being allowed. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that atheists, in the end, are no different to any other human in the self-serving, driven motive to profit at all costs and to destroy our common home without care. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that Jesus was in fact an atheist, whose living words of common sense reason is reduced to irrational, nonsensical blood offerings to an invisible entity called God, in whose name abuse is justified, while Jesus clearly insisted on the scientific, mathematical ways of investigating all things and keep what is best. Yet atheism, like other faiths, made of science an entity of profit, as if money is a savior that must replace Jesus as savior in their lives, instead of applying the common sense reason of the first atheist in establishing what is best for all life and the common good, and to bring that to bear as the foundation of society on earth. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that Jesus confirmed his status as atheist in his statement, I am the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, as a statement of stable, trustworthy, common sense reasoning that would establish a benchmark for deduction to bring forth a stable society, and that in fact Jesus is one of the fathers of atheism. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that the word is in the word atheism is the living action of the words of Jesus, I am that I am, as a statement of realization that man is the reason as the words we live that result in the way things are, and that who I am as reason is what I will create as my reality. This is the foundational starting point of deductive reasoning, which many atheists use when making a decision that there is no God, but few took over the responsibility of creating a reality that is best for all life. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see Jesus was an atheist, because he promoted the principles of reason through the example that to give in equal measure to all will have a result that all will receive in equal measure, and that such reasonable actions from the foundation of fairness as reason, and would ensure a world that would be a measure of goodwill, peace, and harmony. There are the very reasons many rejected all forms of faith as fanaticism and questioned religions, because fanatics placed value in invisible irrationality that never consider the welfare of all beings unless they accept some form of godly savior. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that Jesus established atheism as a reasonable, fair way to live, but those that would lose control and wealth to reason manufactured religion as an effective antidote to reason to keep the masses in irrational imaginary fears. Unfortunately, atheism never capitalized on the foundations made and allowed it to become only a fear-like label that project images of angry, vengeful followers, not unlike what one sees in fundamental Christianity. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to be disappointed that atheism, as a representative group of humans that could be the foundation of a world with reasonable integrity that supports life and magnificent diversity of life on earth, was reduced to holy crusaders that present the same fact as the fanatics of religions instead of the stable, common sense, deductive reasoning from which will flow a stable solution on earth. I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to be disappointed that atheism as a group emerged without a common goal, but allowed itself to be labeled with fear, vengefulness, spitefulness, ego, and brutal desire for profit, no matter what, which were all the same things atheists tried to escape from when they were still part of fundamental religious groups, and that the integrity of atheism is yet to be born. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that atheism, to become directive as a group, will have to embrace the world of law and politics so that we are enabled to directively help those lost in the delusional fears of fairy tale faiths. As many of us, at some stage, were trapped in the illusions, but based our eventual decision to freedom on sound, deductive reasoning. Yet, we allowed ourselves to be divided as a group through overemphasizing individuality, while mathematically reasoning clearly indicates that only groups will attain power on earth, and that religions demonstrate that by using a singular rallying point, as, for example, an imaginary God around which they form laws and control politics. The question atheists should ask themselves is, why have they not learned from the enemies of life to become one group of reason through which the world can be changed? I forgive myself that I've accepted and allowed myself to refuse to see that atheism ended up using the same excuses and justification as religious faiths, that human nature apparently cannot be changed, and that human nature is subjected to a God or a savior, while the answer is clear. Stable, consistent, breath by breath living as deductive reasoning, managing outcomes to always be best for all that I hear on earth, will change human nature and make the need of a God or savior irrelevant. Many atheists realize this, but never capitalized on it due to the fear of being victimized in some way or another. Yet, the modern age atheists allow the group image to be tainted by allowing petty victimization of those challenging the foundation of atheism. I commit myself to remind atheists of the prime objective of deductive reasoning, which is the Jesus message to investigate all things and keep what is best. I commit myself to remind atheists that we must not demonize the message nor the messenger, but rather find in the message that which will support reason so that we may be able to help those still lost in irrationality. I commit myself to remind atheists that throughout the ages, any message that would bring to an end to the irrationality of invisible gods and saviors have been distorted and demonized deliberately to divide any opposition to the current world regime, and thus humanity has remained conquered and imprisoned, either through direct participation in irrationality or through silence and non-action. I commit myself to remind atheists to allow the minority in the group to spread hate and vindictiveness distorts the face of reason as the foundation of atheism, and that because this is allowed by the majority who remains silent in fear of similar vindictiveness, you must ask yourself the question, whether those that misrepresent atheism through hate and vindictiveness are not just still in service of the very same irrational faith they claim to have left behind. I commit myself to remind atheists of the primary objective of atheism as deductive reasoning, which in its very nature implies mathematically and scientifically the principles of self-honesty. I commit myself to remind atheists that faith and religion do not hold the only view on forgiveness, and that forgiveness, used by oneself, is the first step to reason as equals within the objective to free the world from fanaticism, as the disease that holds the world in the shackles of insanity. I commit myself to remind atheists that to base atheism on taking revenge on all those preoccupied by the fear of God is unreasonable, as fear is a condition parents used throughout history to control children without realizing that this fear would bear fruit when the child becomes an adult and create a world that is based on fear seeking redemption from fairy tale God. I commit myself to remind atheists that present awareness based on mathematical reasoning without profit and self-interest motive is the only way to find outcomes that will change the world effectively to be a place where peace and happiness rules and where children can be born into a life of fulfillment. I commit myself to remind atheists that individuality focused on common goals of deductive reasoning do in fact form a group that should act as a group, or the division of individuality will make the principles of the individual useless. As divided, atheism will fall and fanatics will be born. I commit myself to remind atheists that understanding how the mind interacts with the living flesh and has been used to program human response through desire and fear implants is critical to stop and prevent all such methods and to allow deductive reasoning to become the foundation of a sane society. I commit myself to remind atheists to remain as just another label. Using labeling instead of deductive reasoning will put the integrity of atheists and atheism in question and would give rise to the question whether atheists are in fact equally controlled by the possibility of victimization as our Christians are controlled by the possible victimization of an angry God. I commit myself to remind atheists that unless the breaking free from religious programming was based on deductive reasoning without emotion, the newly realized atheists won't be stable, as their formative experience was just a knee-jerk reaction based on emotional instability, which will create just another jerk that should not publicly represent atheism until their foundational reasoning has been clarified as trustworthy and stable. I commit myself to remind atheists that I am not asking you to support me or destiny, but to support life and common sense reasoning to make the world a place worth living in. I commit myself to remind atheists that I and destiny have been labeled by fanatics as a cult, quite similarly to atheism in its infancy, and thus to label what we represent as principles based on deductive reasoning is using religious rhetoric demeaning atheism, as we all stand on the same foundation of deductive reasoning that produce an outcome of common good. I commit myself to remind atheists that I have been accused of brainwashing people that would be quite an unreasonable claim, as I use words at arm's length to stimulate common sense reasoning. Fanatics use fear to demonize the message of common sense through gossip and outright lies, feeding on the emotionally unstable that is found normally only in faiths worshiping invisible cloud people. Brainwashing belongs to the categories of parenting, religion, education, advertising, sales, consumerism, television, and Hollywood, where common sense reasoning is replaced with illusionary pipe dreams and desires. Spreading fear through unreasonable disinformation is the realm of division and control that has given fanatics the power to determine the destiny of the world. I commit myself to remind atheists to commit themselves to a world based in common sense reasoning so that we can restore order in the world and take our home back from haters and fanatics. With this contribution, I hope to elevate atheism as a proud home for men and women of common sense reason that will, as a group, contribute to the establishment of a stable, fair society that will coexist in peace and harmony.